day, everyone. Ed Dudley, Durham, North Carolina. Because if you've been tuning in, you know that's where I always am. One day I'm from South Africa or somewhere else in the States. But until then, I'm still in Durham. But I have my beautiful co-host with me from South Africa, Miss Charmaine Supermoney. How are you doing today?
I'm fabulous, Sulu Ed. I'm always in a good mood, especially if I spend the Ubuntu house with you and incredible speakers. So I'm feeling great. I'm always coming to you from Johannesburg for now.
I love it. I'm really interested in this particular conversation because it's near and dear to my heart because I serve on a board as an interim board chair for a organization that deals with this issue. But I'm also excited about this is the first time I think we have a gentleman on that you didn't call your boyfriend. So mark this date down. Whenever this airs, this is the first person that she didn't call her boyfriend.
He's not my boyfriend yet.
Not
How
yet.
about that?
Yet. So not boyfriend yet. Let's bring him into the studio. Mr. Matt Friedman, coming from Hong Kong. How are you doing today, sir?
I'm doing great. Thank you. It's great to see you both.
It's good to see you. Now, you heard me talk about her boyfriend. So Charmaine has boyfriends across the globe from age 40 to 94. You're not there yet, but hold on. Tell your wife don't get jealous. She likes collecting boyfriends.
Okay.
So we'll start the conversation.
Well, I'm a boy and I'm a friend, so.
Oh, I love you already, Mr. Matt Friedman.
Yeah, it meets the criteria. So, yeah.
Well, I love it. Thank you for joining us. I'm really looking forward to the conversation. So let's just dive right on in. Tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do.
So my name is Matt Friedman. I'm a counter-trafficking expert, or at least that's what they call me. These days, I run an organization called the Mekong Club. And this organization works with the private sector in a positive, supportive, non-naming and shaming way to help them to understand the issue of human trafficking. So we work with the banks, we work with the manufacturers, we work with the hotel industry. And we do this because there are interfaces between the criminal world and these businesses. And oftentimes companies don't know about it. But if the newspapers find out about it or an investigative journalist, it creates a lot of problems for those companies. So we're there to basically inform them, raise awareness, help them to understand the issue, and then to address it if we find it with them.
Mm-hmm. Love it, love it, love it. As I was saying earlier, I sit on a board called United Against Slavery. We're a data collection agency that's focused on human trafficking around the world. So that's why I was excited to get an expert on the line and just talk about some of this subject that a lot of society doesn't talk about. I remember a couple of years ago, the Super Bowl was in an area where there was a lot of human sex trafficking going on, and we didn't know it. And there's different hubs here in America that I can talk about that are breeding grounds for human sex trafficking, but we don't talk about it. So excited to have you on here. So just how did you get into this world? I know how I got into it, but how did you get into this world and to be a counter trafficking expert?
Well, about 30 years ago, I was living and working in Nepal for the U.S. government, USAID. And my job was basically to take resources and translate it into healthier people. I was a public health officer. At that time, we were finding girls that were 12, 13 years old who were HIV positive. Couldn't understand what was going on. This is a very conservative culture. How would they get that disease? So we went to go and interview them, and we heard pretty much the same story over and over again. And it went something like this. Human trafficker, guy around 20 years old, would go into a village and flash a bunch of money around. He wanted everyone to think he was rich. He'd then go and say, I'm looking for a wife. Don't want an urban wife, want a village wife. He'd find a girl 12 years old. It's not uncommon to have that marriage differential in that part of the world. He'd befriend her and then go to the family and say, I'd like to marry your daughter. They're thinking, wow, he's rich, he's handsome, he's going to take care of our daughter, he's going to take care of us. 2 days later, they actually have a wedding ceremony. After that, he goes to the family and says, I'm going to take your daughter to Kathmandu. Don't worry, we'll be back in 3 months. But that isn't what's going to happen. Instead, he takes her to Mumbai, India, to the red light district where the brothels are. So he puts her in a room and he says, honey, stay here. I'll be back in a few minutes. As she was coming in, she saw these people languishing in front, wearing funny clothes. And she says, no, 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 don't leave me. He says, it's okay. I'll be right back. He then goes to the madam to get the $500 for having sold her to the brothel. He has the gold that was left over from the wedding, and he hands the wedding pictures over to her. He then leaves to go to do this again, maybe 40, 50 times in a year. The madam then goes into the room where the girl is and says, guess what? Your husband just sold you to me, and you're going to be with 20 guys a day every day because I say so. You can imagine her shock. No, my husband loves me. No, that's what happens. When she internalizes this, many of the girls say, I will kill myself before I do those shameful things. The madam then brings out the wedding photo and says, is this your mom, your dad, your brother? If you hurt yourself, we'll hurt them. So she's trapped in this situation. To make her into a prostitute, it's quite simple. You simply shame her. So they bring in a couple of professional rapists. Over a 2-day period, they'll rape this poor 12-year-old girl about 20 times until she just lays back and accepts whatever happens to her. After that, she's put on the line. She'll be with 20 guys a day, every day, until after a couple of years, she's so depleted physically, emotionally, and spiritually that nobody wants her. So they throw her out onto the street. So I was seeing these girls. A certain percentage of them would come back. Not all of them. A lot of them languished in India and died of AIDS. But the ones that came back were the ones that we were hearing this story from. But I didn't really understand the evil of it until I actually went to those brothels. I was invited by the Indian government to do public health checks. I had a police officer with me. I went from brothel to brothel. I went into one brothel, and there was an 11-year-old trafficking victim. This girl saw this Caucasian guy, saw an opportunity, literally ran up and wrapped herself around me and said, save me, save me. They're doing terrible things to me. I looked down at this child who was hysterically crying, wearing a dress 20 sizes too big because she was a child in an adult's world. I turned to the police officer and I said, we need to get her out of here. He said, we can't do that. I said, what are you talking about? You're a police officer. He says, well, if we try to leave, we'll both be killed. To make a long story short, we left. We came back with a lot more police, but of course she was gone. Now, every once in a while, we have a test in life. That was my test. I was supposed to get that girl out. I failed miserably. I couldn't eat. I couldn't sleep. And I eventually did what a lot of activists do. I surrendered to the fact that now that I've been exposed to this, now that I've seen it, now that I've looked into the eyes of these victims, I can't turn it off. And so 30 years later, here I am talking to you. An activist was born. And this happens to a lot of activists. We have these types of experiences.
Oh, Matt, has been. Thank you for sharing. I mean, I just feel pain going through my body to only imagine how you felt not being able to save that kid, but and these women go through it on a daily basis. It's just, we live in a horrible world, don't we? I mean, a world that lacks empathy, actually. Matt,
Well,
how do
there
you
are
manage?
4.8 million women in that situation. So just to look at the math associated with that. So every day these women and girls are forced into, having sex acts against her. That's commercial rape. It's a travesty, and it's happening every day all around the world, United States, South Africa, Hong Kong, everywhere.
Matt, you call yourself an expert. It's actually sad that we have a day assigned to it every year to recognize the level of human trafficking that actually happens on the 30th of July, right? Where I'm trying to go with this is, what do we need to do differently to be able to eradicate these kind of acts? Or is there anything? I know you do what you have to, and we all do our little bits, but what do we need to do at a big scale or a big level? I mean,
Well,
is there anything?
Let me lay out some of the numbers first to just put that question into perspective, because it's a great
Sure.
question. There are 40 million people around the world who are in modern slavery. In fact, there are more slaves than any other time in history, according to the United Nations. About 25 million of them are in forced labor, and about, as I mentioned, 4.8 million in forced prostitution. The profits generated from this are 150 billion US dollars a year, second only to drug trafficking. It's the second largest transnational crime. Now, with all of the United Nations and the governments and the NGOs combined working together, According to the Trafficking in Persons report, we helped about 100,000 people out of modern slavery. If you combine those two numbers, that means out of 40 million people, we helped 0.2% of them. So your question is a good one, because we have to ask the question, what are we doing wrong that allows us not even to have a half percent or a percentage point related to this? And a lot of it really comes down to the resources available to address this, about 350 million US dollars a year, which is 0.23% of the profits. So the profits are huge. The amount of money available in the resources is small. The other thing is there's about 20,000 do-gooder types like me around the world that focuses on this, and there's 500,000 greed incentivized criminals. We have to, follow rules and regulations and rule of law and everything. They
They
don't.
don't.
They just modify and change. And lastly, the awareness related to this is abysmal. Most people don't know about this topic. I get in front of, banks, I get in front of corporations, I get in front of faith-based groups, I get in front of schools, and I would say probably 10% know even 25% of what I'm talking about. If you don't know about an issue, you're not going to care. If you don't care, you're not going to do anything. So a lot of what needs to happen initially is to raise awareness and then get people to say, we need to do something about that. That's really a major starting point.
Yeah, I'm still, that story that you shared with me still resonating with me. I'm a very visual individual, and seeing a little girl just grab you, it kind of hit me. Um, how do you? I just want, and not even about the statistics how do you? What keeps you in it? Because I know there's got to be some days that you are mentally just exhausted, and then physically exhausted. What keeps you? What keeps you going in this fight?
Well, I mean, I've been doing this for 35 years. And so probably 3 times I've completely burnt out, where I got to a point where I just said, I can't do this anymore. I was just feeling so bad about the fact that we weren't able to have much of an impact. I was feeling like, there wasn't the support that was needed, and went into almost a depressive state, and then vowed I'm never going to focus on this again. But we don't choose our causes choose us. And so whenever it got to a point where I got through my 2 months of feeling bad about myself, something would happen. I'd start hearing about cases. Somebody would draw me into a conversation, and before you know it, I would be up and running again. And it was almost as if I shed a skin in between those 2 times. Kind of the caterpillar butterfly things. You have to kind of shed something to get to the next level. So each time I've gone through that, I think I'm better prepared to be able to address this type of issue. But the thing about this is that because we're helping so few people, we almost need a metaphor to help us to accept the
Yeah.
fact that our contributions make a difference. And so we use the Starfish Parable. Now, you probably both know that. So you have the father and the son walking down a beach. The beach is 10 kilometers long, and the father keeps stopping and picking starfish that have been, landed on the beach into the water. And he does it again and again and again. And the child finally looks at the father and says, Dad, you can't possibly save all those starfish. This is a 10-kilometer beach. What difference does it make? And he says, well, to the starfish that gets into the water, it makes all the difference in the world.
Absolutely.
So many of us, we cherish our small victories, because if you look at the big picture, it'll overwhelm you and you'll just basically implode from that. So
It's actually a coping mechanism to keep you in to
it certainly
continue
is.
doing. It is. Yeah.
Go ahead,
Matt,
Julie.
Matt, I'm actually curious on multiple levels, so I'll ask a lot of questions. I want to start with I do want to start with you defining actually human trafficking and modern day slavery. What is the difference?
Okay, so what happened about 30 years ago, when I was finding that these young people were in forced prostitution, back then there wasn't a name for this. In fact, nobody even knew that prostitution was exploitative. because nobody paid any attention to women in prostitution. They were considered to be bad girls or criminals, and so
Mm.
you ignored them. But all of a sudden, we're in the brothels, we're talking to them, we're talking about safe sex and everything, and all of a sudden we say, well, how did you get here? And then they tell us the horrific stories, and after a while we're like, wow, this is a human rights issue. So in the early days, many of the cases we saw were cross-border. A person went from Nepal to India or from Cambodia to Thailand. And so because human trafficking equates movement, like drug trafficking, you take the drugs, you move them to another place and sell them, or arms trafficking, where you take the arms and move them and sell them, this cross-borderness was considered to be important. But over time, people started to say, well, wait a minute. There are those cross border cases, but you also have cases where a person goes from one district to another district in a country, or in a city, from one side of the street to the other, and they get exploited. Shouldn't we focus on the exploitation? So when they were looking for terminology that addressed when a person doesn't get paid, they can't leave the situation, there are threats, there's violence, there's debt bondage, and so forth, the word slavery kept coming up. But because people think slavery happened a long time ago, they put the word modern next to it. So
Okay.
modern day slavery is the outcome of the process of human trafficking. And so they're pretty much used interchangeably. And to a certain extent, uh, some countries use modern slavery. The United States doesn't use it. They don't use it because there's no legal definition of it. But in the UK and Australia and most of the rest of the world, modern slavery is the new terminology.
Thank you for that clarification. Okay. When you completed the form that we actually asked you, and most people go, what is the most significant moment in your life? And they go, the birth of my children. And I know you have two boys because you've shared that with Ed and I. And I was quite intrigued when you said it was meeting this young 11-year-old in India. And now it makes sense to me as to why that was a significant moment for you. I can only imagine the emotions that flowed between yourself as well as that child, and why you continue to serve in the way that you do. So thank you. I do want to say thank you for your service, and thank you for the difference that you make to the lives of many. And when you share the stats, it would seem, or when you share the holistic stats and the impact that it has, it may not be that significant, but every single life that you impact and people like you makes a difference. And Ed, I speak to you as well. So it's horrific that what actually happens in today's world, but people like you give most people a glimmer of hope, and especially to that one starfish or the one individual that you've managed to save. It's such a necessary thing. Matt, you do a lot of, I know you've also worked in 30 different countries, having worked in the UN. Was this also part of the work that you've done, or was it this background or that back, or just tell me a little bit more about that, having worked in 30 countries in your capacity as a UN employee?
I started my career because of a bad car accident. So I was going to get a PhD in psychology. I was in New York City, working at NYU, and I was going to live the good life. I was going to get the penthouse of a big building, and I was going to sit there with my notebook, and I was going to take down people's feelings and emotions, and then I was going to translate that into having a really nice car and a nice house outside of New York City and all that kind of thing. And then I was driving across the Brooklyn Bridge. I was working for the American Health Foundation, and there was a terrible accident in a taxi.
Sorry.
So, the taxi wrecked, and, the taxi driver was an illegal person. So he ran away, and I was in the back unconscious, and it was burning, and somebody pulled me out. And as a result of that, I had to drop out of school for a semester. But I had a friend who worked for the United Nations and said, while you're on the dole, why don't you write a report on Zambia? I said, where's Zambia? And I had to look it up on the map. I had
It's
no
in
idea.
Africa, Matt. Come on.
Yeah.
I'm joking.
No, but I didn't even know it was in Africa. I didn't know. Americans, we don't know anything about geography. Back me up on that, Ed. We don't know anything at all.
Nothing.
So, I grew up in Connecticut. To go from Connecticut to Massachusetts requires 6 weeks of planning and visas and everything else. We don't travel. So then I handed my paper and they said, you got to go to Africa. And I said, what are you talking about? That's not possible. They said, you have to do it. We need you there, etc. So they got me to do it. I went to Zambia and Kenya and Switzerland and so forth. And as a result of that, I was just kind of hooked. I never really went back to finish my PhD, and I kept getting these assignments and so forth. So that's how I initially got into many of my early countries. And at that time, I had never taken a public health course. Nobody seemed to ask me about that. So I kind of made it up as I went along and figured out things. And to a certain extent, there's an advantage to that. And that's because I'm not constrained with theories of things. I just look at things and it doesn't make sense or not, and I make a determination. From there, I went to Nepal. I took an internship there, and for 8 years, I worked on both public health and then I discovered this situation with human trafficking. But from that platform, because I was learning about human trafficking and nobody else really knew about it, they kept tapping into my expertise. And so they'd send me to Pakistan or to Bangladesh or one of those other countries. And so much of the work that I did resulted from the fact that there were very few people who knew anything about this particular topic in the early days. And as a result of that, I think it's 42 countries that I've worked with, both public health and modern slavery. And, you both are probably well traveled. You know that traveling is one of the best ways of educating us on all kinds of things, not just our technical skills and abilities, but us as human beings. You take a person, you put them in a country they've never been in, you have to adjust to the customs and, all of the things that exist there. It challenges us as human beings to grow. And so, every time I get an opportunity, or did, to travel to one of these places, I would take it.
So I got just real quick. So, where in Connecticut were you from?
Newington.
I know Newington. I'm from Springfield, Mass. So it's a small world.
Well, that's a 30-minute drive from us. We just go on Route 91, is it? Straight.
Route 91.
Yeah, and you guys got what is it? The amusement park that's there. It's Seven Flags now, or Six Flags.
It used to be called Riverside.
Riverside Park.
Isn't that? So Riverside's a big amusement park that used to be there, and now it's been taken over, called Six Flags, and it's the big attraction from the world. So we got something in common.
What is so beautiful about this? He's speaking from US. You live in Hong Kong permanently now, Matt?
I live in Hong Kong. No,
that's home.
Yeah, for now. I mean, I'm not sure where we're going to settle. We're nomads in a sense. The world is our oyster. We'll figure out where it is. It happens to be Hong Kong now, but it could be anywhere really.
Oh, it's just fabulous, actually, because I'm not even going to go there because that'll be another conversation, being nomads and the beauty of that. Just simple conversations has the ability to connect us. And I mean, you find a common thread and the power of just having conversations with people. I mean, if that little kid didn't run to you and open her mouth and share, you would not have known her situation, right? So the point I'm making to people out there is don't be afraid to take opportunities, but also have conversations with people that you normally wouldn't. That way you could potentially find out stuff and also support and help in ways that you are. Matt, you said this and I'm going to say it again. We are often put in places to be able to have impact. I mean, if you didn't have that accident, and I'm sorry you had to go through it, and I'm glad you survived it, you would not have been on this journey, right? And the impact that you're currently having. So, yeah.
Well, I mean, I wrote a book called Proximity in Time, and the book was based on the fact that we're constantly in situations where we make choices. We think of life as being a fork in the road, but every moment is a fork in the road, and so like there was a time when I nearly got hit by another car when I was driving, and I recognized it's because I took an extra minute to get an M&M's bar, in the 7-Eleven. And if I hadn't done that, I would have had that crash and so forth. So there's this constant kind of movement of things. The other thing is that I think that our life has some kind of a pattern that, is certainly outside of our control. For me, I base it on my faith, but, some people use destiny or whatever. But, I desperately wanted to go overseas and go to Kenya. And I tried everything I could for that to happen. But they kept saying Nepal, Nepal, Nepal. And I said, no. I want to go to Kenya. I ended up going to Nepal, but I came to realize that was right for me at my time, and I wouldn't have done human trafficking if I'd gone to Kenya. It wouldn't have happened that way. I wouldn't have met that girl. I wouldn't have, had my career go in that direction. So, I mean, I'm spending a lot of time kind of looking back at my life and analyzing all of these choices and stuff and coming to realize that there has always been kind of a pattern associated with it that has gotten to me to this point where we're having this conversation, you know?
Yeah.
Matt,
So, but go ahead, Charmaine.
you've written 12 books, right? So
13.
you oh, it's a 13. Oh, sorry, I must get up to date. What's happening to me? I'm like losing it.
No, it
Matt,
came out 2 weeks ago. How would you have known? So,
oh,
I mean, you were right.
congratulations.
Well, it's a novel about human trafficking based in India. And the reason why I wrote that one is, when you write kind of the more traditional books that talk about human trafficking in an academic way, it reaches certain people, but much
Yeah.
of Asia needs storytelling. They need a mama san, and they need a uncle, and they need a father and a daughter and all kinds of other things. And if you don't have that, they don't internalize or understand what it is that you're saying. So I just took 10 years of research and lots of stories that I had collected, and I weaved it together into a novel. And then that just came out a couple of weeks ago.
Well, congratulations. That's flipping awesome. I'm going to list all your books actually on the YouTube channel. So, okay, Ed, sorry.
Yeah. So the statistics, of course, are completely alarming. And you talked about it's not a Hong Kong issue, American issue, a South African issue. It's a global issue.
That's right.
And plight of our world. Speaking all over to different institutions and things, in particular, I want to talk about the UN.
Mm-hmm.
It is such a global issue. What do you see the UN doing as a whole? What are they doing right, and what should they be doing?
Okay, so I'm going to put my hand on my heart when I say this. I believe in the United Nations system. I do. But I spent a lot of time in five-star hotels, eating really good food, talking about poverty. There was a pretty big disconnect between where most of the United Nations people were and where the action was. And that's simply because, by definition, that's what the United Nations is supposed to do. It's supposed to be the non-government organizations doing that. But because my mandate in the United Nations said, learn about the issue and disseminate and educate the governments about this, I felt like I needed to get much closer to the action. So I spent a lot of my UN time in the field. And we even set up a hotline within our office to collect information. And eventually we were evaluated, and they kind of slapped my hand and said, you're not supposed to be doing any of this. You're helping people. You're not supposed to do that. You're supposed to help the people who help the people. So my difficulty with the United Nations is that as an institution, how can you know what you need to do unless you're in the thick of it? And so I happen to have had years of NGO and government and various other experiences that allowed me to understand what I was doing. But there were a certain number of academic people there who were in HIV/AIDS or human trafficking who had never met a trafficking victim. It was all esoteric. It was theoretical. So much of the work that is done is by the non-government organizations all over the world. They're the ones that do the prevention programs to help people to not get into human trafficking. They're the ones who help with the raids and the rescues, and then have the shelters. And then after that, basically try to go after the criminals. But since out of the 40 million people, 25 million is in modern or forced labor, and 60% of that is associated with supply chains, the business have to be involved. So the banks have to be involved. The manufacturers have to be involved because they have supply chains and the potential for factories that could be exploited. And hotels have to be involved because you have sex trafficking that takes place there. And so much of this goes back to your question earlier, Charmaine. What do we need to do? We need to open up new fronts. We need the private sector involved. We need more faith-based groups involved. We need the students involved. We need the general public. But we need them to be at a level where there is almost a turning point where people say, like the global warming, enough is enough. This has to end.
Yeah.
And in the absence of that, so I mentioned this to you guys in an earlier conversation about that rape case in India. It was a 24-year-old student. She was on a bus. They raped her. She died. And the entire country rose up. They insisted that laws change. They protested. They did everything they could because of this one case. And that really changed everything. I'm still waiting for the day when the world says it's unacceptable for, all these people to be in this situation. And post-COVID, the numbers have even gone up significantly more. At present, 25,000 people enter modern slavery per day. We help 137 out a day. Do the math. Again, it doesn't add up.
Wow.
That's is
Yeah.
horrific, actually. Matt, I want to take you through the organization that you started,
Yes.
the Mekong Club. It sounds very fancy. It sounds like
Yeah.
a club where we're just going to hang out and have a cool time.
Yeah.
But first, tell me why you named it the Mekong Club, and tell our listeners as to what the intention behind it and how you drive change through your organization.
Okay, so 12 years ago, sitting in a room with a bunch of UN people, looking at the statistics, and we compared them, and we came to realize that we weren't having much of an impact. So we said, bring all the data together and let's look at where we can have a win. Where can we find something that would allow us to get those numbers up? So what we came to realize is that 60% of the forced labor is associated with supply chains. So we said, well, we have to talk to businesses. So as a UN official, I would fly up to Hong Kong and talk to the bankers and to the manufacturers, and because a lot of the kind of regional hubs were there. And what we heard was, well, we don't know much about this issue, but we recognize it's a business risk, but we're not going to have a conversation with somebody like you. You come from that naming and shaming world. So a number of organizations, some big banks and manufacturers said, listen, we need an organization to help us to understand this, but it has to work with us, not against us. And it has to develop a sense of trust. So we set up the Mekong Club. Now, the reason why we called it that is the Mekong River goes through Southeast Asia. And they said, don't have the name have anti this or human rights that in it, because it'll scare the private sector away. Call it something simple and gentle. Couldn't think of anything better than Mekong Club, so we came up with that. And the funny thing is, I was once at a restaurant and I overheard another table talk about, oh yeah, I heard this organization Mekong Club. I thought it was a tennis club or a golf club, so I went online. Did you know it's human trafficking? Oh my gosh, who would do that kind of thing? I chose not to walk over and to tell them that I was the guy who did it and everything else. I would have under different circumstances, but so we called it that. And for the first couple of years, much of what we did was just basically to make presentations and to talk to C-suite and get them excited about knowing about this. But a number of things changed. Number one, there's legislation there all around the world that basically says companies have to kind of say what they're doing to address modern slavery. That transparency legislation is there so that consumers can see what companies are doing. There are huge lawsuits against companies for buying seafood that could be tainted by modern slavery. So that creates, embarrassment, and people don't want to buy from them. We're seeing media coverage significantly increase in ESG, the metric that is used by the private sector in order to measure whether they're doing right by the world, is now insisting that the S, which includes modern slavery, be articulated in a way that would allow for consumers to see what companies are doing or not doing. So as a result of that, we changed into an association. We have about 60 members, mostly the biggest companies in the world. And what we do is we assess where they are in their journey. We give them the tools and the trainings and the means of being able to protect themselves. And they do it because they recognize that they have to do it to protect their organization. But another thing often happens, there's usually enough people within the company that once they internalize this, they say, wow, this is a terrible thing. By us protecting our company, oh, by the way, we're protecting the world. That feels good. Woo, And so we try to encourage the people who are working on this by saying, you're heroic. You're heroes. You're doing this type of thing. And I'll tell a story related to that if it's okay. And that is, yeah, so I was in Washington, D.C., and I was at a banking conference, the American Banking Association. And I finished, and this guy comes running up and says, I got to tell you this story. I said, okay, that happens all the time. He says, I was taking my wife and my teenage daughter from one part of the United States to another. We got halfway there, pulled into a motel. I got them settled. I was going out for food. I saw this 14-year-old girl being pulled into a room. It looked like forced prostitution. She was so young. I have a teenage daughter. I was really upset. So I went to the manager and I said, I saw this, not knowing if anything was going to happen. Sure enough, 15 minutes later, cop car comes. 15 minutes later, that guy's being taken out in handcuffs. The girl's being taken off to a shelter. He said, that was a milestone in my life. I felt so good about that. So I looked at this guy and I said, well, what do you do? He says, well, I'm a banker. And I said, yeah, I get that. You're at a banking conference, but what do you do in the banking world? He says, I do anti-money laundering and fraud and that type of thing. I asked him if he ran human trafficking cases. He said, yeah, all the time. I said, dude, don't you realize that you're a hero? By you looking at those cases, you have to submit a report to the authorities. You may not see what happens to that, but maybe those police go to another place and arrest it. Do you not realize that your work is relevant and important? And it was like an epiphany for him. He's like, yeah, nobody ever says anything like that to us. But you're right. It is heroic. So I was in Singapore 2 months later. I'm up on stage. There's 600 people there. I tell that story. And I talk about you guys are the heroes. You're helping to address this. I must have had 40 people come up to me afterwards and say, wow, nobody ever says anything about the private sector. All the NGOs get all the support. But it's true. The banks are doing work. The manufacturers are auditing factories. They've been doing it for 35 years. I've seen the factories in Southeast Asia back then, and I've seen them now. They're a lot better. They've been doing the work. So I work with the private sector partly because they're closer to the potential action and they do things a lot quicker. The NGO world can stretch things out forever. You know, we're going to have an action plan for next year and the year after. When the private sector feels like they have an issue, within 15 minutes, they're addressing it because they have to. They have no choice. And that speed is an essential part of why I work with the private sector.
So, Matt, you do a lot of speaking to a lot of institutions. And one in particular I want to talk about is the faith-based institution because it's near and dear to my heart. Um, Typically, across the world, faith-based institutions have an influence on our society.
That's right.
When you go in there and speak on this subject in the faith-based arena, are there any epiphanies in that arena? What are you hearing and what are you seeing as you talk to them? And then more importantly, as a faith-based community, I don't care if you're Christian, you're Muslim, you're Buddhist, what more can we do as faith-based institutions to help?
Well, I usually start my talks and I'll give 4 different stories. You heard one of them, the sex trafficking one, but I talk about camel jockeys, 2-year-old boys that are trafficked from Bangladesh to the Middle East. I talk about fishing boats where 15-year-old boys go out for 4 years and they're beaten and tortured, and many of them don't come back because they get injured and they throw them in the water. I talk about sweatshop situations and so forth. And, you know, if you're a compassionate person, and a lot of faith-based people are, you can't listen to 12 minutes of stories and not walk away feeling like, wow, this is a terrible thing. And then if you put the math associated with, so it's those 4 stories times 40 million people, and we're only helping 0.2% of them, you know, the compassionate faith-based person is going to start asking questions. What can I do? How do I get involved? What do I do next? And so it doesn't matter, as you say, the denomination or the type of religion. People are people are people are people. And many of those people are interested in wanting to do something. And so our call to action to them is quite simple. You know, learn about the issue and then share it with others. That's one. Another one is if you're going to buy a branded item at a store, you know, go in and see whether or not that company has a policy. If they do, congratulate them. Companies love to hear that. If they don't, you say, listen, I like your products. I'd feel better if you had a policy related to that. Volunteering. You know, in my organization, we have about 70 volunteers. Most of them are professionals from the banking world, from the manufacturing world, tech, whatever, because there's a certain percentage of people. If I get in front of 100 people, 10 people are going to self-identify and say, this is my issue. Okay. Others, it might be animal rights, or it could be global warming or bullying or whatever. But we fish for those people, and when we are able to find them, then we say, okay, who do you work for? You work for this particular bank. Get me an entry so that I can come in and talk to them. Or you work for the school system. I'll come in and do a school talk or whatever. So we empower those people. My youngest volunteer was 9 years old. This girl saw me in a documentary and she contacted me and said, Mr. Friedman, I'm 9 years old. I saw you in a documentary. I'm going to sign up and I'm going to help. What do you need me to do?
Oh, that's
You're 9 years
powerful.
old.
I love that. Oh my
Well, but I initially said, you're 9 years old. What can you do? She said, don't worry about it. And then she said, 9-year-olds are the new 16-year-olds. Give me a chance. So finally, I said to her, what do you feel like you have a skill at? She said, I can find anything on the internet. And so I gave her a bunch of data tasks that I had my second year Yale law students try to do, and they failed miserably. And within 3 days, she found it because that was her God-given gift. So I say, if you're a poet, use poetry. If you're a dancer, dance related to this, or public speaking or writing, or if you sell t-shirts, whatever, use that skill in your volunteer approach, and then it becomes a win-win. But you have to have this as your particular issue. Like, I had people who are global warming people working for me, and I said, don't work for me. Go work for that organization there. Your heart's not in it.
Yeah.
So you want to find those people. And lastly, donate and fundraise. COVID has decimated a lot of NGOs around the world. All the resources went off in other directions. And so at a time when the number of modern slaves could go from 40 million to 60 because of all of the desperation and indebtedness, we have probably a quarter of the organizations won't exist in the next year. So, the funding is needed. And, the faith-based groups tend to be very generous when it comes to that. And I've received a lot of money from different organizations that are faith-based. And probably they're the largest contributors. And so the money being available for the organizations doing this is an important part of the process.
So just real quickly, speaking of funding, how's your organization being funded? How, for anyone that's listening to this conversation and their heart is touched and their heart should be touched because this is, like I said, this is a big issue. How are you being funded? And then if somebody is listening to this, how can they support you with funding?
Yeah, so we get a certain percentage of money from the corporations themselves, because we offer services and support. We've received money from faith-based groups. We've received money from high net worth people, from traditional donors, from governments, the US government, the UK government, the Canadian government, Australian government has given, New Zealand government, and just citizens that want to donate. Part of the kind of incentive for working with an organization like us versus, other organizations is the efficiency that goes along with it. There are some organizations that will raise $10 million to save 2,600 people. Ours budget's less than $500,000. And, we are able to do the same because it's the private sector that identifies where these people are and they fix it and they use their own resources. So from a cost benefit analysis, working with the private sector has the potential to have much more impact. And again, with the percentage of money available to address this not going up, you have the potential for there to be a situation where we have to get more with the limited money that we have out of our resources to really make a difference.
Mm. That's good. That's good.
Well,
Sure.
it's beautiful to know, and I'm not saying this lightly, that you're having the desired impact in the corporate sector with the organization. And the reason I say this is for so long, people have not been conscientious buyers, and people have not cared about the reputational risks. I mean, some corporates have been buying from factories from China that was using child labor, and we're turning a blind eye to it. With what you're doing, Matt, what I'm hearing is that the awareness, the impact, you're highlighting the goodness within people is having the desired positive outcome. I mean, those 40 people that came up and said, I didn't realize I'm a hero. So the way we share our story, you're a great storyteller, I must say. The way you share the story and the way you drive the emotions out and the way you land your messages is a beautiful way to get people to reflect and to start driving the change. So the point I'm making is we need to be I need to be a better storyteller. I wish I could like tell stories like the way you do, but not in a way that drives meaningful change and impact. I'm
Definitely.
giving you a compliment in a long-winded way.
Well,
My apologies for that.
thank you very much for that. But I want to respond just a little bit about kind of the positive side of things. I mean, there's good and bad in the corporate world, but there's good and bad in
Everything.
the faith-based
Everywhere.
world, and there's good and bad in the NGO world or whatever. We tend to try to focus on the good and the encouragement and the positiveness because we feel like that's going to have more impact. And we try to find
Yeah.
people who for whatever, resonate. But one of the questions that I often get from people is, which companies should we not buy from? The naughty companies, the ones that are doing wrong. And my response, or which should we boycott? And my response is we can't answer that question. Some companies find themselves in the news, but it doesn't mean that all the other companies don't have issues as well. So until we get an objective way of looking at all companies, it's almost unfair. So instead of a boycott, we emphasize what's called a boycott, which is the opposite of a boycott. A boycott says don't buy because
Don't
they're
buy.
bad. A boycott is buy from this company because they're doing everything humanly possible to try to protect their business. And they will demonstrate it and they'll put it on their website and they'll talk about it. So those companies are out there, and ESG is reflecting and amplifying these things. And so I think eventually what you will have is a list of companies that have overtly and aggressively demonstrated that they are trying to ensure that their entire business is free of any kind of exploitation. And a lot of the big brands are doing that. And we should celebrate that. So I almost went into working with the private sector with a bias that, the private sector didn't care. But, living in countries around the world, the private sector sends their kids to the same schools that we do. They have the same issues and problems and same hopes and dreams and aspirations. And there's good people and bad people. And we just have to give them more credit for the things that they do that are actually quite positive.
Yeah, thanks. Um,
Sure. I
I,
like the
I,
concept of a boycott and a boycott.
yeah, that's good. I just want to go back because stories resonate with people. Stories cause people to reflect and a lot of times take action. And I can't shake this. You talked about camel jockey,
Yeah.
the story that you shared. And for some reason, I don't know why I can't shake that story. Can you share that story with us? Because especially stateside, we hear camel jockeying. We think of a camel and somebody sitting on top of the camel. Could you share that story with our listeners?
Yeah, so I lived in Bangladesh for 5 years, and one of the big issues that we were facing back then were 2-year-olds that were being trafficked from Bangladesh to the Middle East in fairly large numbers. And when a lot of people would say, well, what could you possibly do with a 2-year-old? They don't have the concentration or the manual dexterity. They're just infants. What do you do with them? Well, you put them in the back of a camel. Why? Because if you put an infant on the back of a camel, what do? They kick and scream, and what does the camel do? It runs. So they race camels, and they use infants because they're light and they won't slow the camel down. Now, assuming the child makes it to age 5, a lot of them don't because they fall off and get trampled by camels. They're beginning to slow the camel down. They're gaining weight. And so a lot of these kids are thrown out onto the street. So at a time when most kindergarteners are basically, starting school, you have a 5-year-old boy in a foreign country, doesn't speak the language, by himself, having to fend for himself. You can imagine what kind of life they're supposed to have. Now, in many of the more kind of public areas, they're using robots to do that. But in the more traditional areas, they still want to have a person on the back, and they're still using these kids. And so we still hear about these stories. So our job was to try to figure out where are they in these countries? How do we repatriate them? Because they don't know where they came from. They were 2 years old, and some of them were just like playing on a train or something in a village. And then the train took off and they couldn't get off. And then, the traffickers are in the train stations looking for these infants that nobody basically picks up. And that's how they end up in these countries. But, it's just a horrific story. But just one other story, just to, in line with storytelling, is the fishing boats in Thailand. So you have a 15-year-old boy. He's living in Cambodia. His family says, "Listen, we're poor. You got to go and work. Go to Thailand and find a job." So he goes to Thailand. He's looking around for work, not finding it. Finally, traffickers see this kid, and they go up to him and say, "Hey, listen, I'm from Cambodia. You're from Cambodia. Looks like you need some help. Let me lend you some money." Okay, well, now that you have my money, you have to stay with me. But guess what? I got this great job. I'm going to take you down to the ocean, put you in a boat. The boat will go out for a couple of months. You catch some fish. You're a guy. Guys love fishing, right? After that, you'll come back. You'll get money in your pocket. So he goes down. He gets on the boat. The boat goes out, but it doesn't come back after 3 months. It stays out for 4 years. This poor kid, 16, 17, 18 hours a day, every day he's going to work. If he doesn't, he gets beaten, he gets tortured. The only food he'll eat the entire time he's there is rice and fish, nothing nutritious. They give him stimulants in order to get him to work. If he gets injured or sick, as I mentioned, they'll throw him off the side of the boat. And at the end of the 4 years, he gets off and he doesn't get anything at all. He goes to the captain and says, give me something. Captain says, you're illegally in my country. Get out of here. Guy says, I'm going to tell the police. Captain says, go ahead. We own the police. This is just, one of so many different variations on the theme. You can go on in just about every sector. You can find people in these exploitative situations.
Wow. Thank you for sharing those stories.
I'm actually annoyed that those are stories to be told, though. Sorry. When I say annoyed, I mean, it's so sad to think that another human will exploit a human being to that extent, especially kids. And it's just horrific. Yeah. Thank you for sharing, Matt. When I'm verbalizing, it's not an attack on you. It's just
no.
I'm feeling like.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to give you another story, and that's the story that basically.
You clearly don't love me, Matt.
I know. Well, anyway.
You're not going to be a boyfriend, Matt, to keep it up.
Boy and friend. That's it.
We got this.
So, So years ago, when I was a very angry activist, I decided I was going to write a book, and so I went from shelter to shelter in Nepal to interview the women and the girls. And I went to one shelter, and there was a girl named Geeta. And every time I approached her, she said, no, I don't want to do the interview. But as I interviewed everyone else, she sat and listened to everything. So when I finished and I was leaving, Geeta comes running up and says, I changed my mind. You can have my story. So I sat on one side of the table with a number of people, and she sat at the other side of the table. In over a 3-hour period, she just told the worst story I had ever heard of rape and torture and disease and betrayal and murder. I honestly didn't know what to say. I had heard a lot of stories, and this was just way off the charts. So finally, after a pause, I turned to her and I said, wow, Geeta, you must be so angry at those traffickers for the horrific things they did to you. She paused, and she said, no, I'm angry at you and you and you. She pointed at us. She said, where were you? She said that every single day she woke up praying for somebody to come and help. Nobody came. Said that she, went to school till she was 12. Everything was right out in the open. Nobody was doing anything. She said she wasn't angry at the traffickers. She said they're just bad people being bad people. She said she was angry at the good people, at society for allowing a 15-year-old girl to be commercially raped 7,000 times only to eventually get AIDS and she was going to die. So she pretty much called us all out. She understood that the 20,000 people like me were insufficient to really make a difference. And she was asking, why doesn't the world care enough when these horrific things? And she kept saying to me, she was wagging her finger saying, why aren't you down there right now helping them? What are you doing here? Go down there. These are my sisters. They need your help. They need somebody to go out there and do that. I can't answer the question. I couldn't answer the question. But it's a fundamental question. Why is it that one of the most horrific things, the loss of freedom, and when I say loss of freedom, it means many different things. You don't have choices. You can't make decisions. You can't determine the course of your life. You can't be educated, get health care, anything. It's a loss of everything. And yet this is happening to 40 million people around the world. How can this be? What is wrong that we have not been able to sensitize the world to the extent that they say that we see huge crowds of people, in front of the governments basically saying, change this, fix this, make this go away. I don't get it.
But Matt, we can have all the legislation in place, right? It will still not stop a cruel man or a cruel person from doing what they intend doing, even if you look at corruption for that matter. So I think it's more than just having legislation to try and prohibit it from happening. We need people with heart, soul, desire to drive this change and speak up. What Gita said was, I'm sure people saw things happening and turned a blind eye because they don't want to be
Yeah.
involved in it for
Yeah.
their own safety. Is that
Yeah.
possibly
Well,
why
that's
people are
true.
not speaking up as much?
It's true, but let me go back to the legislation. In the United States, you have 50 states, and there are still states that allow a 14-year-old girl who's on the street selling herself to get arrested and put in jail. By definition, she's a human trafficking victim. She should be put in a shelter because by her age, she doesn't have the agency to be able to address that. So, as a
Yeah.
fundamental building block, just standardizing the legislation in the United States and getting all of the law enforcement people to understand it and making sure that law enforcement understands where the shelters are and everything else would prevent that 14-year-old girl who gets arrested and gets a record and then can't get a job and then ends up spending much of her life in prostitution. So legislation is one of many
There's a
pillars.
place for it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. I agree with what your statement is true, but at the same time, it's all of these other things that have to happen as well. But I mean,
Yeah.
if you look at prior to kind of Al Gore's kind of inconvenient truth, a lot of people didn't take responsibility for global warming. It was somebody else's problem. Then all of a sudden, he made the point that
Mm.
we as human beings are contributing to it, so we have to be part of the solution. I would argue that if a 14-year-old girl in any place in the world is in forced prostitution, we should all care about that. And on the forced labor side, a lot of the
Absolutely.
food and the electricity and the clothes and everything we get, a percentage of it is tainted by modern slavery. We have the responsibility to be associated with that.
I hear you. It's just, this was quite deep though. Like, I thought I was going to have this amazing, beautiful conversation and we were just going to flow into it. No, it was deep but
Was an
necessary.
amazing
I mean, I'm glad you shared the intensity of the stories to the extent that you have. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So Matt,
I like, yeah. I mean,
go ahead. Matt, this is normally where
no,
I
you go.
would ask a question is like, you got a magic wand, what would you do, to change the world? But my question for you is a little different. And it's not even a question. Well, it is a question. It's like, we don't know how many people are going to view this or when we share it, but you're standing in front of a huge audience of the world, um, where a lot of us have our blinders on, just going about life as we know it. What can we do as a society to get more educated and then activated to help in this cause?
Well, I'm going to answer it in even a broader way, not just with human trafficking, but with everything out there. Just take the 15 or 20 biggest issues and problems out there and put them on a list. And my response to this audience is that we live in this world. We are responsible for what happens in this world. We have a responsibility to be associated with the solutions to this world. And it
Mm.
doesn't take much for people to figure out what their cause is and to set aside a certain percentage of your life, even if it's one day a year or 1 week a year, or 1 month a year, whatever it is that if 10 million people did that for the environment or animal rights or human trafficking or bullying or any of the other things that are out there, we would be in a much better place. We, as human beings in this world, have to be the healing agents. We
Mm.
have to take a portion of the responsibility. But there is very little out there that basically encourages that message. I go off and spend 53 days on my vacation going from place to place talking about this because I feel this deep desire to try to get that message across. And I'll get in front of anyone. Don't sit next to me on an airplane because if you have 14 hours, you're gonna be an expert in modern slavery because I'm going to try to convert you over to this world. We have to begin to look at the world differently. It's not about the governments and the United Nations and the NGOs. It's about us as human beings, healing things, fixing things, being a part of things, working forward on things. And that message, just we have to recalibrate the way we look at these things. And that's my message. And I say that quite often. I train corporations on that, the Be the Hero talk that I do, and because it's such a necessary process.
Love it. Charmaine, you have another question, statement?
No, I don't have a question. I'm just like taken in. It's like you kind of pull me in with that statement. It's such a powerful statement that needs to be heard by everybody, actually. Um, and I'm going to go back to your starfish analogy.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes people don't do anything because they are of the opinion that, my little contribution is not really going to have the desired impact. But all those little desired impacts will eventually get us to the place that we want to be, where hopefully modern day slavery does not exist.
Yeah.
And Matt, what do you think is lacking in this world? Like, why? I know, but in addition to greed, right? The reason this is quite a big, profitable business that I'm even like, Satch even utilized the word big business and profitable and things of that sort. I mean, because we shouldn't be talking on that level. But what is it that allows for this to happen? Is it, in addition to greed, is it lack of empathy? Or what do you think it is?
I visited some of the poorest places in the world, where they make less than 50 cents a day and they live on that. And these communities are pretty tight knit. They're not complaining. They're not talking about how horrible the world is. They have a sense of community. They have a sense of participation. They have a sense of understanding that they are a part of a humanity which is within their area. That is what's been lost: the sense of community, the sense of belonging, the sense of unity, the sense of accepting the fact that I can disagree with you and you can disagree with me, and that's okay. And I don't have to say that you're horrible and you don't have to say I'm horrible. We can just accept the fact that we are different, and that we can have a dialogue and a discussion and everything else. But this lack of looking at the world as a big community for which, if you are kind of walking outside the door and you find like all kinds of trash that blew onto your lawn, what do? You clean it up. Why can't we, if we're walking down the street and we see the trash, we pick it up, or if we go to another location, we do? The point is that, like, as we see these things that are in front of us, my statement is that whether you believe it or not, you have something to offer. You can
Absolutely.
do something, you can tell somebody, you can get involved, but it's no longer acceptable for us in this world to be in a situation where we don't accept some responsibility. So find your cause will find you, actually, and then commit yourself to doing something. It's that simple. And even if it's 1 hour, if 10 million people did 1 hour, that would add up to something big. Back to the starfish analogy.
Oh, that was such a powerful statement. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Ed, do you have something?
No, I just, thank you for the work that you're doing. So many people would have aborted the mission after just a few months. 30 years later, you're still fighting the good fight. So I'll say it. Well done, thy good and faithful servant.
Well done to both of you for amplifying this and, getting people on your show and asking the right questions and getting people to be educated and informed. You're part of the solution yourselves. And so you've just contributed. You've done your one thing related to human trafficking. And Ed, you're doing a lot more because you're part of that board and so forth. And Charmaine, I can tell that you, just as a human being, you're very compassionate and caring and loving and all of those things. If you have a discussion like this, they come out and they open people up, and then we all learn, and we're better off as a result of it. So thank you both for what you do as well.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
You're an incredible human being, Matt. I mean, I don't know you like intimately, but I do know your wife, and she introduced us to you, so which is fabulous. But just the way she speaks and your connection, and it just talks to your holistic approach to life, from your home to humanity to making a difference to the world. So the point I'm making is thank you for both of you being incredible human beings, the work that you do, the impact that you make around the world. And I want to say, I don't have any words for you, but from the bottom of my heart, just thank you for what you're doing. And I can say a little bit more, like the levels of impact that you have, the lives that you've influenced in the ways that you've had with those little girls, and the stories that you tell. Keep saying it. And I just wish you lots of love, lots of energy, lots of blessings. Good luck with your tour, and the impact that you're going to make across the globe. And as Ed said, if we can help in any way, let us know how. And
Yeah.
to the people listening out there, please do one thing at least that Matt has told you, even if it's an hour. Start with an hour a month and drive the necessary changes that the world needs. Matt, is there something else you want to say
No, just thank you
before
very
we
much.
close out?
No, it's fine. Thank you so much for the opportunity to talk to you both today. I really, really appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah. So Matt, we
And
appreciate.
thank you for staying up at 11 o'clock at night.
Yeah,
So you're
that's right.
incredible. Like you're like
It's
an
a Friday night.
all-rounder.
It's a Friday, so no worries.
So Matt, we love you. We appreciate you, and I will just simply say, from one Christian to another, thank you for living your faith out loud.
Well, thank you for doing it as well.
Appreciate
And
it.
Charmaine, just thank you for being who you are as well. So
Yeah, exactly. So
Oh, thank you,
this
Matt.
this has been another Ubuntu connected conversation with the incredible change agent, Matt Friedman. This was a different conversation than we normally have, but it was a much needed conversation. Um, I challenge you to do one thing. I like to say, sometimes your cause chooses you, and you choose it. Choose your cause. Let's make this world a better place, one person at a time, one starfish at a time. So, to everyone, have a great day, have a great afternoon, or a great night. We appreciate you. We love you all. God bless.
bless.
Thank you.